Welcome back, my friend, to the second video of day one of our Power to Peasantry Summit. I do hope you enjoyed my conversation with Susie Lipscomb. Now, in this video, you will hear from the delightful Emma Rutherford of the Philip Mould Gallery in London. Some of you may know Emma from my podcast, the Tudor History and Travel Show, but for those of you who don't, Emma specialises in Tudor and Jacobean miniatures, and she has made several television appearances and advises the very popular Antiques Roadshow. Well, Emma first introduced me to the secret world of miniatures a couple of years ago when I in fact interviewed her for my podcast. Well, I found that conversation so enlightening that I just had to include a chat with Emma here as part of the summit. So what fascinated me so much when I first spoke with Emma was how she described the way in which miniatures were indeed a very private way in which women could communicate secretly with loved ones. Through miniatures, of course, we also get to see glimpses of real women of the time beyond the usual stiff reserve of formal Tudor portraiture. So I invite you to sit back and relax and enjoy as Emma takes us into the beguiling and private world of Tudor miniatures and explains how women use such art in a deeply personal and intimate way. Okay, just one more thing before we get into the video. Tomorrow you will receive another notification 10 minutes before the first video of day 2 goes live with all the links for the day ahead. So with all that said, earlier this year, dodging COVID, I headed on down to London to meet with Emma at the Philip Mould Gallery. And that is where you join us now in conversation. So, hello Emma, and thank you for inviting me here today and for taking part in the Power to Peasantry Summit.
You're welcome, it's a pleasure.
So we're in the Philip Mould Gallery down on Pall Mall in London. Yep. What a wonderful space you have here.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm so lucky to be a consultant here at the gallery for their portrait miniatures. I've worked here, for 14 years now, out of 25 years of specialising in portrait miniatures. So yeah, it's a really exciting place to work. We've made some really amazing discoveries since I've been here, and yeah, surprises every day in miniature form.
It's such a privilege to come in here and look at some of the portraits that you have on the wall. Anyway, we must turn our attention to the focus of today. So, of course, the summit is all about how women express themselves, their status, their femininity, their power, and we've been exploring a number of different angles as part of the summit. But today we're here specifically to talk about that very topic, but from the perspective of art and in particular portrait miniatures.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No. Very exciting.
So, of course, as you say, this is your speciality. And some people may have heard our podcast from, I don't know, last year when we talked about portrait miniatures. Yes, but of course, this may be the first time that people are hearing about the subject. So before we dive in specifically to our topic, I thought it would be good if you could talk to us a little bit about, what portrait miniatures are.
Yeah, of course. So a lot of people have the misconception that portrait miniatures are just reduced oil paintings, but in fact they've got absolutely their own history. They're very specific objects, and in the Tudor period They were unbelievably important politically, diplomatically, and as very personal objects. So the first sort of myth to bust really is that portrait miniatures are called portrait miniatures because they're small. But in fact, they're defined by their media. So they are always watercolour on vellum at this period. And they are watercolour on vellum because they derive directly from the manuscript illumination. And the word miniare, the Italian word miniare, is illumination, and so the word miniature derives from that. But then there's another word, a Latin word, minium, which is the red lead colouring in manuscripts. And so miniare, minium, miniature, they're small because they're painted for a specific purpose. They're portable, they're personal. I'm sure we're going to talk a lot more about their purpose, all the P's. But they're really they're defined by their medium. So they have to be watercolour and they have to be painted on vellum. And the practitioners of portrait miniatures, the artists who produced them, really focused on portrait miniatures. They didn't tend to paint oil paintings, although there are exceptions. But they're very much focused on this as a very specific art form within the Tudor period.
Yeah, so I guess whatever skills made for a great miniaturist didn't necessarily transfer over to being a great portrait artist. No,
and in fact, in some ways, portrait miniatures have a much higher status at this period than some oil portraits. Think about it, portraits of Elizabeth I. A lot of them are by people, workshops and unknown artists, and there are many copies after some of her official portraits and taking face patterns and that sort of thing. The other thing about portrait miniatures that makes them so special is they're always painted from life. So they're always ad vivum, and the person had to sit in front of the artist in order to be portrayed. And for me, as an art historian and someone with a real interest in history and, like you, what life was really like, they give such a window into a more private sphere of the period, partially because they're painted from life.
Oh, that's fascinating, actually. You've reminded me that from our earlier conversation. But yes, how different. Yes, it really is a snapshot of that person as they were. How wonderful. And when did they, I know you said they came from illuminated manuscripts, so when did portrait miniatures first really emerge as an art form in their own right?
Well, a lot of early manuscripts have a portrait incorporated into them somewhere, and often this represents the person by proxy. So you might have a wonderful calligraphy H with a portrait of Henry in there, and this could be on a very official deed roll or legal document, and that portrait of Henry would be as if he were there. So it's representing the king in a very symbolic way, and of course he would have sent a representative on his behalf as well. But there's something in that portrait that's heavily symbolic. And I think somebody writes rather alarmingly that with a pair of scissors you could create the first portrait miniature from, well, I think the quote is, with courage and a pair of scissors.
Oh, you would need to, wouldn't you?
Yeah. You can create the first portrait miniature simply by cutting out one of these portraits from an illuminated manuscript. So the earliest portrait miniature is actually of Henry's daughter, Mary, and it's dated to the 1520s, and it's by an artist called Lucas Hornbolt, who's also producing illuminated manuscripts at the same time. Henry quickly has quite a few portrait miniatures painted of himself by the same artist, by Lucas Hornbolt, who interestingly had a sister called Susanna, who we believe is also painting portrait miniatures, but we haven't been able to necessarily match them up. So they really start in the 1520s as emancipated from the manuscript and become objects and portraits in their own right from that point.
So it really is almost as a Tudor innovation in
yes,
some ways.
Absolutely. And depending on whether you're English or French, it's an English or French innovation. Right. So portrait miniatures have a very, very long tradition, in particular in England and in France.
Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction to portrait miniatures, and I'm sure we could talk a lot more about miniatures in general, but let's focus on our topic today.
Sure.
And I think we're going to explore the use of portrait miniatures by women in two different contexts. One, if you like, the patron, the person who commissions the portrait miniature. But as you've already alluded to, there were females who were portrait miniaturists.
Absolutely,
so maybe you could just, to set the scene around that, talk a little bit about those two themes.
Sure, yeah. So, women at this period are patrons and collectors of portrait miniatures. Portrait miniatures really start off very, very close to the royal court, and they are, when they first begin to be introduced, they're totally connected to the royal family, and they don't really leave the court. So they're very, very high status objects. So really one of the first people who is a patron and collector of portrait miniatures is Elizabeth I. So she's a good place to start. But she also used portrait miniatures. She used them politically, diplomatically, but also on a very personal level. And in fact, as an example, I've got a couple of very, very tiny portrait miniatures here.
They're amazing.
Which give you a sort of idea of scale. So they are sort of like a ring. They may well have been worn first as
I've seen these before, and I just imagine them to be so much bigger, but they really are tiny,
They are
aren't
tiny, absolutely tiny. So I think these two, for example, may have been originally worn as rings, but they would have had covers over them. You wouldn't have been able to see them quite as openly as this. And of course, we have Elizabeth here, and her favourite, the Earl of Leicester.
Yes, and they look like they were painted at the same time. They look like they've been together forever. Do we know?
They're a bit of a mystery actually, because one of the things with portrait miniatures is obviously they're part of an exchange. So particular points in people's lives, portrait miniatures were exchanged, and one of those points is the point of betrothal. You would exchange miniatures of each other, and obviously you can see the size of miniatures. I mean, these are particularly small, but they would be worn close to the body. Ladies tuck them in their bodice. You have women wearing these lovely black silk cords in oil portraits that disappear down into their bodice, and you can be sure that if you're able to pull it out, there'd be a portrait miniature on the end of it.
Yeah.
So they were literally worn next to the skin. You know, they're incredibly personal objects. And we think these two date to about 1575, and they're possibly part of Leicester's last-ditch attempt to persuade Elizabeth to marry him. But of course, he did get married secretly a few years after that, in 1578. So
were they at Kenilworth? Were they at the Great?
Quite possibly, yes. This has been suggested. And Elizabeth here is wearing a sort of veil as well. I mean, it's I don't know. To me, they're just unbelievably romantic, and an incredible indication of the relationship between these two, which of course everybody would love to fly on the wall. And they're painted by Nicholas Hilliard, who, interestingly, he's a miniaturist or limner, as they were called, and miniatures were called limnings. He was Elizabeth's chief image maker, so she and her court and advisors get rather fed up of her image not being controlled, and Hilliard is really brought in to gain some semblance of control over how she is presented, particularly when portrait miniatures are being exchanged with courts. So we know that Catherine de' Medici at the French court, at the Valois court, requests portrait miniatures of Elizabeth, and she possibly does that through Leicester. And Leicester is Nicholas Hilliard's most important and first patron, who's probably the person who introduces him to Elizabeth. So Hilliard here has got an absolutely unique insight into the relationship between Elizabeth and Leicester, just as he would have had an insight into everything that was going on at court in terms of romance and diplomatic marriages. And yeah, he would have known everything that was going on, because he would have had bride and bridegroom come to him before marriage. And yeah.
So we're talking about patrons, and Elizabeth I as a patron of portrait miniatures, and and you've also alluded about purpose and function, and you gave a few of the different types of purpose and function. But this would be Elizabeth, although she may not have commissioned that pair.
No, that's more likely Leicester.
That's more likely Leicester. But were there any that she commissioned from a more of a romantic point of view, do we know? You know, that personal from her to Leicester, for example. Do we know any of those?
I don't know that we know that, but we do know that she kept portrait miniatures in her inner chamber, and there's a story, very famous story of her inviting the Scottish ambassador in to this inner chamber, and she pulls out a portrait miniature of Mary, Queen of Scots, and kisses it. And obviously she's very astute, obviously, and she is doing this as a sort of, you know, this is how much I love my cousin, and you can report this back, which of course he did, and the story has been repeated ad infinitum, but it's also an interesting indication of how portrait miniatures were kept very, very close to the person who owned them. And if they weren't being worn, they're in the bedchamber, then they're next to the bed. You know, I think one really interesting thing about portrait miniatures at this period is the control that a woman had over these small images, which was so important, because if you're wearing a portrait miniature, it's up to you who sees it, and they're usually in a locket. So this is an original locket on this miniature, and it's got this lovely blue back and this white enamel border, and it's got this little lip at the bottom here, and there would have been a cover over it. So all portrait miniatures would have been covered. So if this was your lover or husband, or only you could lift the cover and show people who the portrait miniature was of. And there weren't many things that women had control over.
No.
But because miniatures were worn, it really was up to them who saw the image there. One exception, of course, is Elizabeth herself, and in another anecdote, she spots Cecil's niece wearing a miniature of Cecil, and insists on it being handed over. She wants to see who the miniature's of. When it's Cecil, she asks for it to be handed over, and then she pins it to her shoe and stomps around court with this miniature flapping on her shoe. And Cecil has to write a very lovely romantic poem or sonnet, I can't quite remember, to get her favour back. Then it's pinned to the elbow. It's elevated, literally up Elizabeth's body.
How fascinating!
and at court, you know, this causes great, gossip.
Yes,
and,
intrigue and gossip.
Yeah, but I mean, this is Elizabethans loved all of this. And I mean, I know we were talking about women, but just another aspect of the portrait miniature is the fact that often they have this lovely calligraphy on them, which is very integral to the portrait itself. And Elizabethans loved symbols and puzzles, and it was just very much part of court life and court culture. So there's another miniature here of a man, and he's got a starburst, gold starburst here, and then something called an impresa, which is like a motto, and this one in Latin means "I will brighten." And we're not quite sure why that would be on this portrait, but his lover would have known what that meant. Does it mean he's going to brighten her day, her life?
Yes, yes.
He's got a wonderful, bright mind. We just don't know now. But there are lots of secret symbols and messages within these tiny portraits.
I really wanted to talk to you more about that, and perhaps you could share some more examples, because I think those are the things. The faces are beautiful, of course, and captured in such fine detail, but I actually personally love the other little bits. And often I don't know what the symbols mean, but I'm so intrigued. So again, going back to maybe how women might express themselves or their identity or messages through portraiture and miniatures. Sorry. What do we see? What are some of the other examples? You've illustrated one. Are there any others that you could share with us?
As I say, portrait miniatures are often commissioned around the time of betrothal. So what you do get in miniatures is some of the most sort of sexy and revealing and this is me type portraits that you get in the whole gamut of types of portraiture of the period. So again, I've got another miniature here of a very young woman, and she's got this lovely garland of fresh flowers around her head, and you'll notice her gown is incredibly low cut.
Yes, it is, isn't it? Very revealing.
Much more revealing than you would get in an oil portrait, where the cloak might be pulled across by her disappointed father, but and she's got her hair down. And this is she's Dorothy, Countess of Leicester, who we know ran off at a very tender age, teenage, as a teenager to get married. Without her parents' permission.
Really? Wow, that's quite something, isn't it?
And she's very young in this portrait, and it was a great love match. The couple, I think when she died, her husband said, I'm going to die too, but in fact he lived for another 20 years. But she's here shown with all the sort of attributes of youth, but it's also, I think, relatively sexy portrait compared to perhaps a more formal type of oil portrait that would be commissioned for posterity as well. And the other thing about the scale of miniatures is the intimacy in terms of how many people can look at them. And I mean, you're not going to be able to see from that distance what I can see from this distance, and it really is a one-on-one experience. My introduction to miniatures was seeing, when I was very young, at Hever Castle, a portrait of Anne Boleyn, and just the idea that Henry VIII had held this portrait and looked at it and sort of felt emotionally connected in a way that if he'd stood with his courtiers around a large oil portrait, they might have all had different opinions on it and different thoughts. And this is such a one-on-one experience. And I guess for women, I mean, miniatures, there are a couple of miniatures which I think we discussed in the podcast of men really in a state of undress, and there's...
I'll never forget the flaming, the flames in the background.
Exactly, yes. And, I think you'll probably be able to show your viewers some of the images, and I think they'll be quite surprised at just how astonishingly erotic these images are. And they have the flames of love behind them, they're bare-chested, and they are undressed, that you would never have an Elizabethan nobleman leaving his home looking like this. This is for your eyes only. And I think it gives an insight into what Elizabethans found sexy and what Elizabethan women found attractive and sexy, and I think that's just incredibly exciting. You just don't really get that anywhere else.
Yes, and I'm looking to a portrait just to my right here, and it's such a far cry from what you've just described, isn't it? The oil on board, yes, and it's all very formal, and she has such a formal pose. There's no sense of real warmth in there at all, but what a contrast to some of the miniatures that you've been talking about. And I know you did talk to me about that miniature with the chap with his bare chest and his, and I did go and study it, and yes, he's a hot bit of stuff there, isn't he?
I think yes, I was listening to a lecture at a Zoom lecture from the Portland collection from the Harley Gallery a couple of weeks ago, and there's a miniature there that all the curators have known for all time as the sexy beast, and I 400 years later, you can still fall in love with some of these men,
yes. And women were enjoying those portraits
exactly.
in the privacy of their inner chambers, or
correct.
if they were certainly aristocratic and wealthy enough to have inner chambers. Thank you so much for sharing about how women from the aristocratic classes and the mercantile classes made use of commissioning, limnings, but also this fascinating story of the women behind some of these amazing portraits. Maybe just to ask you, where might we best go and see? I know we talked about this on the podcast, but perhaps it would be really great to be able to point people in the direction of where they can best see some of the best portrait miniatures.
Well, I mean, luckily a lot of portrait miniatures were commissioned by families, so if you live near a local National Trust English Heritage property, they normally do have a few portrait miniatures there, but in London the National Collection is at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and they have incredible early miniatures, really fabulous. The Wallace Collection has Holbein's self-portrait in miniature. I mean, there are so many around, but probably I would say the Victoria and Albert Museum, National Portrait Gallery, of course, again, has some fabulous early miniatures. Well,
that's going to keep us all going, and I'd love to see that miniature of Holbein. I've never seen that before.
Yes,
so that
he's got a terrible haircut.
Yes. Oh, well, that's lovely. Thank you so much for joining us today,
so welcome.
Emma. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.